Australians are becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the country's political system. For years now, polls and focus groups have revealed a consistent disenchantment. Tonight, Lateline can exclusively reveal the results of the most detailed survey yet on political attitudes. Compiled for the Museum of Australian Democracy, it shows that voters give their elected representatives a resounding fail, and they're hungry for political reform, including the right to recall their local MPs from Parliament and make them face another election for their seat. In a moment, we'll hear from a panel including Independent Federal MP Cathy McGowan, Matthew Gordon, co-founder of ALSE, a digital democracy site, and the head of the St James Ethics Centre, Simon Longstaff. But first, Margot O'Neill has the details of this latest survey.
You've been told to sit down.
If Australians had their way, our major political parties would face a revolution. Parties would have to give their MPs a free vote in Parliament rather than follow the party line.
I understand that the Prime Minister's addressed this in a press conference in Turkey in the last few hours. I haven't seen what she said, but let me say I support what it is that she said.
Voters also want the right to recall their MP to face another election if, for example, they lied or were corrupt.
Tony Abbott has admitted that his plans will hurt people.
There'd also be stricter limits on political donations and advertising, giving new political groups a better chance of competing.
3 more years of Labor failure.
All in all, Australian politics would look and sound radically different. At least that's according to the 3 most popular reforms in a survey done for the Museum of Australian Democracy.
I think momentum is definitely building for reform. We should understand this as a new era in liberal democracy, a new stage in liberal democracy.
But wouldn't reforms like a free vote,
I'm using this as a conscience vote,
destroy party discipline and undermine parliamentary stability?
Would it? Or would it actually mean that political leaders would have to persuade their party about the course of action that they are taking? Good public policy debate is about having a good row.
If a free vote's not enough to quicken the pulse of professional politicians, what about giving voters the right to recall their MP for a fresh election? Consider this, just 8% of those surveyed believe their local MP does a good job.
If you have the threat of voter recall, politicians will be more responsive to the needs of their constituents. Between 80 and 90% of Australians believe that they have little or no influence over national decision making.
The survey shows that Australians of all ages still embrace democracy and its freedoms and stability. But
there's a growing disenchantment with the nature of the political process, and particularly with the current politics on offer. And they associate that with what they characterise as the untrustworthy contemporary politician.
When asked what they don't like about democracy in Australia, the top 3 responses are: the media has too much power, politicians get away with broken promises, and big business has too much power.
So in other words, the view out there is that in order for governments to get their way, they're having to provide concessions time and time again to big business.
It's young people who are leading the way to democratic renewal. Turns out they're not apathetic, they're online.
They are more active than any other generation in terms of social media, in terms of collective action through the internet. They are what I would term information activists. They share information. They debate public policy in a degree of detail that leaves, the Australian Parliament to shame. So in our view, young people are in fact the sail and not the anchor of Australian democracy.
Margot O'Neill, Lateline.
Let's take up some of the themes from that story now with tonight's guest. Joining me to analyse the state of Australia's democratic condition in Melbourne is Matthew Gordon, the co-founder of ALSE, an online forum linking political leaders and voters for policy debates. In Wangaratta is Independent MP Cathy McGowan, who famously snatched the seat of Indi from the Coalition's Sophie Mirabella, who'd held the seat for 12 years on a comfortable margin. And with me here in the studio is Simon Longstaff of the St James Ethics Centre. Welcome to you all. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Kevin McGowan, just 8% of the people polled in that survey said they thought their MPs were doing a good job representing their communities. Why such disenchantment?
So I think there's a general sense that there's apathy as well. But my experience of what's happening in rural and regional Australia, and certainly in Wangaratta and North East Victoria, is that that's how it was, and it's changing. And some of the work we're doing up here is absolutely making a difference. We had some seminars a couple of weeks ago looking at democracy, and we had over 250 people turn up to country halls to talk about, and the topic was democracy. And the level of discussion and the level of interest was huge. So I'm thinking that we're actually on a cusp between how things were and the movement that we're creating here is really creating some change.
So are you suggesting that people don't see the need for reform, or that reform is coming?
So I think in Indi, they did see the need for reform really clearly, and the community-based approach to reform, that working with young people like we did in such a big way, and people felt, and they got success. They thought, that we actually do have the power. If we get organised, we can actually get the change. And that wind of change is blowing through the community and bringing with it, I think, enormous interest in what the future, what 21st century democracy really could look like.
But while 80 to 90% of people in that survey thought their voices didn't count, clearly in Indi they did at the last election. What I'm curious about, though, is the fact that as an independent in a lower house dominated by government MPs, does your vote really count for much?
My representation counts for much, and the ability for me to work in Parliament to represent my community is very strong, and that's the commitment that I've made to my community, to be a representative. And I think it's a critical point that you've made, Emma, because I think people have lost trust in the voting process, and what they want much more is representatives who will actually represent them. And so I think that's what's actually happening in Indi, is you've got a process where they're saying of me, the Member of Parliament, you're our servant. We will give you a little bit of authority to represent us. And I think that's a really different thing to what people are getting and they're saying they don't want, when the whole debate about a vote in Parliament, which is not actually about representation, it's about those things that we heard, it's about big business, it's about media, and it's about vested interests. And I think people are saying they've actually had enough of that. What they want is more representation.
Matthew Gordon, in that survey, dissatisfaction with Australia's current political system was highest among the young people, 18 to 30-year-olds. They're more likely to join an online policy discussion than to actually join a political party. What sort of impact is that digital engagement having in Canberra?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I would say that what it is showing is that young people above any other generation are probably more engaged and more informed about the policy issues and the detail. Traditional forms of engagement, whether it be joining a political party or writing a letter to the editor, are no longer prevalent in this generation, but perhaps posting and sharing content online is now defined as a political act. I think the problem with it is that the discussion that's going on online and the lively debate and the passion that comes with it is so far removed from the actual decision-making process. In fact, we have a massive gulf with the conversation that's happening online, the sharing that's happening, whether people are sharing the petitions, sharing questions that they're asking on Our Say, for example, or perhaps even the latest segment of John Oliver's Late Show presentation on, a critique of the Australian political scene. None of this is really being heard or further debated or informed within, where decisions actually get made.
Simon Longstaff, so how does that translate to the decision making? That kind of engagement, which is clearly quite active online, when or how might we see that play out in Canberra?
Well, I'm not sure if we're going to see it play out in Canberra directly. Part of the problem is that a system which made sense decades ago has been taken to its logical conclusion now. And a number of the political parties now have started to become dysfunctional in what they demand. So the Australian political parties are so much disciplined in them, much more in the way they apply the whip than any other democracy in the world. They're so disciplined, which means it constrains debate. You have a situation in which political parties, which are essentially private associations in contending for power, at least in a state like New South Wales, have started to destroy trust in what is a public institution in the Parliament. And so what you're seeing now is, across the political spectrum, people coming together, young and old, and I think they're starting to look for people like Cathy McGowan, clearly successful in the electorate of Indi, and they're saying we will find a different mode for expressing our political will with people who will represent us. Not simply be our slavish delegates, but people of good judgment who will take into account the things we're saying. And I think young people were just as much part of the conversations in that movement in Indi as older people, and that's where you're seeing it expressed on the ground.
So you're thinking in future elections, Indi will prove to have been sort of the tip of the iceberg?
I think it's an interesting possibility. I mean, if political parties if they don't reform themselves, you're likely to see something which might be described as charter groups forming, loose associations amongst independents who share common interests and perhaps certain core elements about what constitutes good governance. And I would predict, actually, that it's very likely to grow out of rural and regional Australia, where there's already a very strong affinity, good close connections, and these common interests. And that will change. It will actually break the mould in Australian political history, I think.
Cathy McGowan, members of Parliament are almost always required to vote along their party lines, but this survey shows most people would prefer their MPs had a free vote. I'm wondering, do you suspect your parliamentary colleagues would welcome such an opportunity?
So it depends on the topic, Emma. And one of the things that I see, and one of the reasons why I actually got elected, was that the issues facing this particular community are not political issues. They're issues of infrastructure. You know, our trains are not working. Our mobile phones, we don't have mobile phone coverage in many areas.
But ultimately, pardon me for the interruption, but ultimately it will be politicians that fix those issues.
Yes, but it'll be across party lines. It'll be the demands of the National Party, Liberal people representing regional seats, and independents such as myself who'll say that these infrastructure issues are actually not a matter of politics. They're actually a matter of nation building, but not nation building necessarily for the city. It's nation building for the country. And I think there's a really interesting thing is going to happen that's the result of me being elected. I didn't appear by magic. I got elected because the people of Indi wanted somebody who would actually represent them in terms of this infrastructure business. And I'm thinking it's not just an optional extra. I think the people of Australia would say if the major parties continue to come up with policies that don't actually represent the needs of the community, then as Simon was saying, they'll do themselves out of business, because the job of politicians is actually to be of service to the community. And certainly in my community they understand that, and they want their taxes returned to them in terms of service delivery. And so it moved from being a safe seat to becoming a swinging seat, because the people absolutely clearly thought that they weren't getting a return on their investment, which was voting in one particular way. So I think it's actually not so much what you're saying about parties and about voting, it's about the ability of our political system in the 21st century to absolutely represent what the people of the country are saying they want.
But as the Parliament stands at the moment, we do have a system where two major parties generally dominate. Matthew Gordon, if the major parties couldn't rely on their MPs' loyalty on the floor of the Parliament, wouldn't the reform process become a little chaotic?
Well, perhaps it will be, and perhaps that's an okay thing. As chaotic as it is already, when I tune in to watch what happens in Parliament, all I really see is a group of pale, male, stale people yelling at each other, and as a young person, I'm hard to find in that yelling what's relevant to me and what's relevant to the issues I see at a local level. I think the cultural change here with professional politicians is that To be a great politician, you need to be a great leader, and you need to be able to listen and understand and make sure that you hear what your constituents are saying to you. You need to make sure that they feel understood and validated. But to be a great politician in the political party process, you need to be a great manager. You need to know who to have coffee with and who are the discrete number of relationships you need to have within the political machinery to get into your position of power. And I think we're going to see a bit of an unravelling of that political culture, and hopefully something a little bit more idealistic or a bit more optimistic in the same sense of Voices for Indi, a cohort of politicians that are willing to act locally and think locally and facilitate the views of the community as opposed to make decisions on behalf of the views of the community.
Simon Longstaff, do you agree?
Look, I do in one sense. I think it's quite sad in some senses. The great political parties used to be defined by what they really stood for, and of course now they've gone from being differentiated according to ideology in its best sense to simply being machines contending for power largely towards the middle part. And the rise of a group of people, what's sometimes called the political class, where if you're on the Liberal national side you become a ministerial staffer and you inexorably proceed through to pre-selection, and on the Labor side it's union and officials and others. There's a sense in which people are saying this system is taking us for granted. That is, citizens saying that. And citizens are starting to say, well, there must be a better way. And to go to the heart of the question you posed, I mean, if you go back to the great parliaments of the 18th century in the UK, the mother of all parliaments in the House of Commons, they didn't have that fixed discipline which we see in the Australian party political system. There was much greater fluidity. People would be able to negotiate around questions of principle and practice. And I don't see why we couldn't loosen things up within the Australian Parliament and still have good, effective government within this country.